Every election, Americans debate the same question: who would make the best president? But I think that question hides a deeper one. What actually makes someone good at being president? Because history does something interesting. Some presidents win in landslides and then stall once they are in office, while others limp into Washington under controversy and leave having reshaped the country. So before we argue about names, we have to understand the job itself. What is this position really asking of one person? When you zoom out far enough, the presidency tends to break down in the same kinds of situations. It does not usually reveal itself during campaign season. It reveals itself during moments of pressure. That is where the real demands of the office become clear. Consider what happens when the world becomes unstable. The president sits at the center of global pressure. Wars, alliances, trade disputes, nuclear weapons, and intelligence briefings that most of the country will never see. At that level, even small miscalculations can carry enormous consequences. Composure and long-term thinking matter more than political optics. A president has to absorb urgency without being consumed by it, and hear aggressive advice without immediately acting on it. You can see this clearly in October 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the edge of nuclear war. Military leaders urged immediate airstrikes, and the pressure to appear decisive was overwhelming. John F. Kennedy slowed the process down. He chose a naval blockade and opened diplomatic channels behind the scenes. The response was firm but measured, and the crisis de-escalated. That moment was not defined by boldness alone. It was defined by control. Richard Nixon faced a different version of global pressure in 1972 during the Cold War. He reopened diplomatic relations with China after more than 2 decades of hostility. That single move reshaped global power dynamics and forced the Soviet Union to rethink its position. It was strategic repositioning on a global chessboard. Franklin Roosevelt dealt with pressure on an even larger scale during World War II. He was not only focused on winning the war, he was already thinking about what kind of world would follow it. The alliances and institutions that emerged afterward reflected that forward-looking approach. Different eras and different personalities, but the same core demand remains. The presidency requires steadiness when the stakes extend beyond the country's borders. Being effective abroad, however, does not automatically translate into success at home. The American system is intentionally designed to resist concentrated power, and Congress exists to slow presidents down. Effectiveness, therefore, depends on whether a president can work within that resistance instead of simply fighting it. Lyndon B. Johnson understood the machinery of Congress intimately. Before becoming president, he had spent years mastering Senate procedure and personalities. When civil rights legislation stalled, he pushed relentlessly, negotiating, persuading, and applying pressure until the votes were secured. He did not rely on inspiration alone. He understood how the system actually moved. Ronald Reagan approached the challenge differently. For much of his presidency, the House of Representatives was controlled by the opposing party. Instead of allowing stalemate to define his administration, he leaned into negotiation and public persuasion. Compromises were made, and legislation still advanced. The presidency demands more than conviction. It demands operational skill within a divided structure. Then there is something more subtle. A president can manage international crises and pass major laws, yet the country can still feel uncertain about where it is going. This is not dramatic failure. It is something quieter. It feels like drift. George H.W. Bush's presidency highlights this tension. He successfully led an international coalition during the Gulf War, and the military campaign was swift and strategically effective. But during the economic slowdown that followed, many Americans struggled to see a long-term narrative for where the country was headed next. There was competence and experience, but the broader trajectory was not always clearly communicated. Compare that with Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression. Roosevelt did not simply implement programs, he explained them. Through his fireside chats, he walked Americans through what was happening and what the next steps would be. He provided a sense of direction, and direction changes how people interpret hardship. Without it, governance can feel reactive, even when it is competent. Under all of this lies something more basic: trust. The presidency concentrates enormous authority in one individual, and if people begin to doubt that authority is being exercised responsibly, everything else becomes harder. George Washington set the tone for this from the very beginning. After 2 terms, he stepped down voluntarily. No crisis forced him out. He simply relinquished power. That decision established a precedent. That power in the United States is temporary and conditional. Trust is not created by slogans. It is built through consistent restraint. When trust weakens, foreign policy becomes suspect, legislative negotiations become more combative, and direction becomes less convincing. Trust is the foundation that makes the rest possible. When you remove party labels and campaign rhetoric, the presidency repeatedly tests the same core things. Can someone remain steady when global pressure intensifies? Can they move policy through a system built to slow them down? Can they give the country a clear sense of direction instead of allowing drift? Can they hold immense power without abusing it? No president handles these perfectly. They cannot. They are human, operating within complex historical moments. But effectiveness seems to come down to balance. The presidents who leave the deepest marks on history tend to show steadiness across all of these demands. Not perfection, but balance. And maybe that is the question every election should start with. Not just who do I prefer, but who can withstand those tests? Do you agree with this, or am I missing something? Write in the comments below. And if you want to understand how power actually flows in the United States, how decisions really get made, and how leadership shapes outcomes, subscribe. That is where we break it down.